All right. All right. Thanks very much, Scott, for those kind words. Today, we're going to be talking about bone, all about the biomechanics of bone and the actual formation and strength of our bone and how we get it and where it comes from and everything related. So, bone, we know, protects organs, skull, vertebral column, thoracic cage surrounding those organs, giving it strength, protecting it. We've got, creates these, this is a bit loud. Like the umbilical brothers. Down there might be better, right. So, rigid kinematic links, so our body gets its rigidity, obviously, from its bone system. Creates sites for muscle attachments, which obviously facilitate movement. So this is the way we move, all starting from bone. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of impact on bone at various times, like where the muscle attaches and what it's used for is going to change the strength of a bone depending on where it is. So bone is largely inorganic compounds, which means these are the minerals, these are the things that the body can't make or produce itself. So we take it in from the outside surroundings. Predominantly, we're talking about calcium. 60% made. Now, bone's very hard because of this. There's only two things in the body differently, which is dentin and enamel in our teeth. So bone's basically, besides our teeth, the hardest thing in our body. We've got the organic compound. This is the part that the body produces. This is predominantly collagen fibers, making up about 30%, and then the rest is water. Now, we have already seen this image before. We've got our structures of our bone, and whilst it looks very solid, it's quite porous. There's different, canals and blood vessels running up all the way through it, with our structure called the Haversian system, and one of these units called an osteon. So we take lots of these osteons, we put them together, they work like channels, creating these blood vessels and nerves and all kinds of things running through them. And that's what it looks like through like an X-ray type situation. And you can already see the different levels in thickness. Particularly look at that where the compact bone's kicking in down there through the shaft. You can see the real thickness in the wall. Look particularly at this point of the inside. It's thicker than the outside of that compact bone. And we see that whole sort of upper level, very much spongy bone, looking quite different. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these properties later. So we know we've got compact bone. Now, I've been referring to it as that, and that is correct. However, there's two names. It's often referred to as cortical bone. So they're often interchangeable, and we interchange them as well. All right, the outer layer of our bone, so we already know that part. And the other name for spongy bone is also called cancellous bone. I don't know why they do this to us. Like, depending on where you read, there's lots of different names for the exact same thing. But that's, depending on where you read, they'll use one or the other. We're just going to use both. So you know what we're talking about, just to make it really confusing. Now, when we look through a different X-ray through the cells, this is what it looks like. We know that it's made up of similar substance. Our left, we've got our compact or cortical bone, cells really lined up, packed in tightly. And then we've got all this space and this loose mesh type material in the spongy bone. And we remember that those struts or layers are called tuberculi. So often, those parts of the spongy bone are called tubercular bone. That's where the name comes from. It's another name, meaning pretty much the same thing again. So bones have this two different types of bone that come together that gives it different types of properties. And it combines in a different way called, and that word then, anisotropically, meaning different mechanical properties depending on which part of the bone we're talking about. So what that means is that the outside can be really strong and brittle, and the inside can be really weak but very flexible, not too dissimilar from a sheet of glass on the outside. Glass is quite strong until it breaks and then it shatters. And on the inside, like a mesh. So it's hard to snap a mesh, but it's very easy to bend a mesh. Right? So this one here, hard to bend. When it does, it shatters. This one here, easy to bend, but hard to actually break. Now you combine those together, that's kind of what bone is like. And we measure these properties, not just with bone, but with all materials, through a stress-strain curve. So when we look at the properties of any material, we're always developing a stress, which means the load that it can actually take, and the stress and the strain, meaning the amount of deformation before it breaks. So when we look at the loading behavior of a typical bone, and this is what a bone loading machine looks like, this is how you test it. You put a bit of bone in there, and it gauge measures the different force at different, compression, tension, shear, torsion, and we end up with all these different figures. And that is typically what a bone deformation curve looks like. So it's got an elastic region, and then it's got a plastic region, and then where C is, that means it's snapped. That's like gone. So if we look at the elastic region, this first region, it's quite linear, right? It's not quite, but it looks very linear in this picture. Basically what that means is the stress up the side, that means that as the load goes up, it deforms a bit, it bends a bit, if you like. The load goes up, it bends a bit. Right up to point B at the end of the elastic region. Now at this point, any bending, you take the load off, it just goes back to where it was, no problems. That is different to if we continue into the plastic region. So the plastic region means that its load's gone up, it begins to deform, and now you can see there's not much more load, not much stress, but the strain is continuing, which means with little more load, it begins to bend quite heavily, right? And this plastic region means that when you release the load, it doesn't go back to how it was. It stays deformed. And then finally, you reach point C where it just snaps, bang, bone's gone. That's typically how a bone is put. So it goes stress strain, linear, bends a bit under load, release it, it goes back. Put a bit more on, it changes shape, doesn't go back. You put a bit more on, it breaks. Now when you look at the two different parts, so the cortical bone represented on our far left, and then this is trabecular bone. This is referring to the bone within the spongy bone, so we can just say the word spongy, right? So cortical bone, look how strong it is, but does not really change shape. Once it breaks and fractures at all, it's gone. So it's a lot to get through it, and then that's it. But whereas our trabecular bone, or our spongy bone here, not much strength to actually move that, but it's got the ability to really deform and change shape quite a lot. There's a lot, it goes right out here on the strain graph. Compression being stronger than tension, and that's pretty much for all things related to bone. So when you look now at tension, okay, tension, that other graph was compression. Most bone, because it's built for compression more than anything. When you test the bone, it's typically tested under compression. Our tension looks similar, but the stress is not going to be as great because it's not as strong in tension. And if you pull it on the axis, now can be a little bit confusing to read this, but if the top picture means it's its strongest when it's pulling it straight up and down. Now, if you pulled it into tension, but you didn't bend the whole bone and then did it again, if you just took the bone at a diagonal and did it, it's a bit stronger. A bit weaker. So if you took a bone that's standing end to end and pulled it outways, that's the bottom, that's very weak. Right? So the confusing part here is the white picture makes it look like you're tilting the bone onto its side. The bone is always up and down. You're pulling it from the white. Right? So a bone up and down, if it's pulled outways, look at it, it barely changes shape at all. It just goes up a bit and then just shatters, gone. So bone is weak in tension. It's particularly weak in tension when you're pulling it sideways in tension or not in the way it's meant to be loaded. Now, if we compare bone to other materials that we know, like glass and metal, we see the differences. So glass and metal, pound for pound, are stronger than bone, right? Second thing is, look at glass. It goes up, so it's got, this reasonably high sort of elastic region. There is no plastic region at all with glass. It goes up, there is no deformation. When that breaks, it goes from, it looks exactly the same to shatters. There's no bending during this process. You look at metal, strongest of all of them, but when it bends, it's got a really, really big plastic region. So it can change shape and stay. Everyone might have, bent a bit of metal before and just let go and it stays bent. You can see that in metal. And that break in the graph represents, it actually goes well off this graph, right, out of proportion. A lot stronger and a lot bigger plastic region. Now, bone, we're looking at a bit of a zoomed out picture here. The elastic region is linear, but there's a slight curve on it, just curves as it begins to go into more strain. That means when it begins to yield or fracture, it doesn't just normally fracture in one hit. It'll just begin to microfracture, bend a bit, crack, and then break, right? As opposed to the others, which don't do that. So it's that layering of bone means it doesn't tend to all break in one hit. It'll microfracture, slight bend in our curve indicating that, and then completely explode after that. All right, so Bone can withstand approximately 190 in compression megapascals is what it's measured in, 130 in tension and 70 in shear. In other words, it's significantly stronger in compression, less so in tension, and the worst during shear. And of course, when it breaks, you know, we can do this all day long, just throw up some nice pictures of things broken. Right, that's the one good thing about doing the old bone lecture. When people look a bit sleepy, you put up something gross. Right, they're rarely loaded in one way, which means in order to even break that leg, that's like sheared, but in order to do that, it's got all kinds of different things going on. Now, the reason is because bone cells are not lined up all in perfect arrangements. And I'll show you that in a moment, but we could load a bone in one of 6 different ways. Tension, compression, and shear are the ones we've done already. We can bend a bone, we can torsion through a bone, and then we can do all kinds of just combinations of them all at once. Tension we've already kind of touched on a little bit. So it's when you pull the bone end to end. Now, we know that it lengthens and narrows. So we know that bone is not particularly built for tension, and we know that if it gets injured, an example of the most common injury of a tensile loading is our fracture of the calcaneus. Right, this is reasonably common. This is essentially an avulsion fracture, if you like, because the bone is pulled away. What's on the end of that? Our Achilles tendon. What's on the end of that? Our soleus and our gastrocnemius. In other words, the gastrocs and soleus have essentially out-strengthened the bone. They've pulled on it so hard it's ripped off, and then we have a fracture through our calcaneus. Now, compression, we also know it's built for this, right? So it should be reasonably strong, but of course, up to a point. It'll become wider before it breaks. So if you released it in the plastic region, you'd end up with a shorter squash bone that's not broken yet. You put a bit more on it, it breaks, usually through some kind of compression loading. So again, it's stronger in compression than tension. Most common being our compressive vertebral fractures that occur most commonly in the elderly. Right? So we know this. He's looking pretty happy. I don't think that's his back. I don't think he'd look anywhere near that chirpy. Right, so it becomes shorter or wider, eventually breaks. So if we took that vertebrae, even just before it fractured, it would actually be a bit squashed and a bit wider than all the others. Now, this is also common around the ends of the femoral heads, so the neck region. And you go femoral head fracture around that neck. How is this possible? This is a really interesting one. This is really common during the old traditional psychiatric electrotherapy treatments. So they used to put the old electrode through the guy. Look at that. That took a long time to just develop this picture. Right? And what would actually happen, actually the glute muscles around those femoral necks and head would clamp down so tight it would actually crush the bones inside. Right? So that's what we're talking about here, the compression fracture through this area. So do that a few more times, take your mind off that. Now, when you go shear, it means, okay, we're weak in shear. Bone is weak in shear. It'll break quite significantly in shear. But when a bone is put under shear stress, it doesn't tend to be just shear. Whenever you do shear, it actually always does other things as well. And that is all off the back of this structure here. The actual bone cells are lined up more so like that, like grid patterns that are like diagonals. So if we just think about that, if we press down on that in compression, some of those fibers are running kind of on diagonals and shear sideways. Same if I stretched it, some of those diagonals are kind of like going to be going at diagonals and shearing. Right, so in other words, sort of under tension loading, because the cells aren't all stacked in perfect arrangements, when you do anything in compression and tension, you have shear, and when you do shear, you have compression and tension. Sort of always happens at the same time. Same with bending. Whenever you bend anything, you're going to have a combination of tensile and compression. So we end up coming back to these two no matter what. Because when you think about it, like this part here might be a tensile force, this is a compression. Think about you take a stick and you snap it. The bit on the top is in tension, the bit on the bottom would be in compression. Bone will tend to break in the tension part because it's weaker in tension. So we have a few different ways we can load a bone in bending. And they're called 3 or 4 point bending. So a 3-point is exactly that. If I've just like snapped something, that's your 3-point bending. Now, where that typically happens, the bone will fracture at the middle force. So wherever I say, if I got my stick and I just do it over there, it's going to fracture around where I put that force or in the middle or whatever. Right? We see this a lot in the body, particularly with what we call this ski boot phenomenon, which is the falling body in a ski boot that didn't move. Right, so picture that. This guy's skiing, he's having a great old time, zipping down the mountain. I don't know, the ski just stops. Body weight's going that way. Front of the boot is there. The tibia fractures. Where does it fracture? Typically fractures the back because that bone is put into tension at the back. All right, so that's your force of the body already going in that way. Front of the ski boot, that's your 3-point bending. It'll tend to fracture around the back. Now, what does the body do to combat this as best it can? Because it's always under those bending loads. Even if it didn't fracture, even if you just hit something smaller, there'd be tension there. The muscles respond by neutralizing the tensile load. So, in other words, see the first picture on the left, you've got the compression at the front, you've got the tension at the back. There's this one here, if the soleus and the gastroc contracted at the same time to put the load, to put the actual structure back into compression rather than tension, the bone's a lot stronger. So the muscle here activates to try and place the bone into compression where it's strongest. It's like our safety feature. Same thing occurs at the head or the neck of the femur. So if we think about our femurs are coming out of our coxal bone, our acetabulums at an angle, that is always going to have a bending moment on it, right? They're always going to want to bend. So the left would be the tension created by that bone wanting to bend out. Now, the gluteus medius helps to hold up those legs in to even out the loads and put that bone back into compression. So rather than the whole neck being under tension, sort of still got obviously tension force there, but compression of the gluteus medius as well. Again, protection mechanism, that's how the muscle works to neutralize these loads. Now we've got a 4-point bending technique. This is if two equal loads or two equal placed in the opposite direction. So let's have a beam or whatever, and I just place both hands, one on each end, and then I go bang down like that. Right? Where does it break now? It actually breaks at the weakest point because there's not one point that I'm applying load. So it could be anywhere in the body. You see this a lot during manipulation of the old stiff leg and rehabilitation. Sometimes people have, you've got your hand on the hip, your hand on there, they're trying to rehabilitate, they're putting load on the weight, bang, they snap the person's leg in half. Right? Where does it break? At the weakest point. Where's the weakest point? Normally where the break or something was before. Right? So in other words, what the 4-point is trying to say is you don't have to just bend around one single thing. You can place two loads down as well, and that's still going to create a bending force. And in this case, it'll break in the weakest point. So torsion contains elements of all three as well. So when you place something into torsion, it'll shear, it'll compress, it'll be in tension, again, because the cells are not lined up, in these perfect arrangements. So when you see something break in torsion, so this is like our torsion, common in sporting injuries, someone gets sort of stuck and they turn and their bone breaks, right? Because it's got torsion, tension, tensile, it's got compression and shear, the bone is strong in tension. You don't tend to see the tension fracture, but you'll see the shear fracture and you'll see the tensile fracture represented by a diagonal line. And that's where it kind of goes, that cuts in a bit and it goes lengthwise and it goes out. Pretty indicative of that twist because that's the tension and the shear sort of showing up during the break of both. Compression doesn't really show up because that doesn't break first. All right. So let's talk about, that's general principles of a bone. So a bone, it's measured by stress strain. Stress is the load, strain is the deformation. It goes up elastically. So the elastic component, I should say, is fairly even. Where you release it, it rebounds. You keep it going, it bends, that's the plastic region. You keep it going, it breaks. That's the key points to remember. Now we go fatigue. Again, you just looked a bit tired. Best part, we just do all this all day long. Who knows how many there are, I don't know. So when you go bone fractures, so these are loading fractures, so fatigue fractures. Now there's two ways you can do a fatigue fracture. So you can either go a single load that exceeds the overall strength of a bone, or you can go a repeated small amount of load over and over and over that still exceeds the overall load that the bone can manage. So fatigue fracture is also called a stress fracture. So the general sort of graph you draw is you go strenuous exercise, right? you've got muscle fatigue. Now, muscles normally, as I said, they've got that protection mechanism going on. So when the muscles are fatigued, you either get an altered gait or a lock of the shock absorbing capacity. So one or the other, you're either going to change the way you're loading or they're not really going to be protecting you anymore, right? When either one of those happens, you get abnormal loading. So a bone is placed under more stress than it otherwise would like to be. And then you get altered stress distribution and ultimately a fracture. Now, let's go case study on this. Straight from the textbook, these two. You've got a 24-year-old military man. He's asked to run 90 meters with the person on his back. After 50 meters, the man collapses with a fatigue fracture to his left femur. So he's got someone on his back. He starts running. He gets 50 meters in, and his leg just like explodes. Right? That's what we're talking about here. Now, that is the way a overloaded stress fracture would occur. There's just too much load for this bone to handle, bang straight through. Now, you get increased muscle fatigue, creating micro damage. Eventually, it explodes. Second case study, a distance runner performs many kilometers running each week, leaving his muscles fatigued. Right? He's fatigued. He's got altered loading now. Repeated dose on the same thing. Very common to get a stress fracture in his foot. Now, I'll bring this up. So many people have been asking me. I've got a classic story whereby I got banned for life from the city of surf. This is a true story, right? Because people are going, oh, city surf's coming up, Lee, like, you're going to do it. And I'm like, oh, I can't. Why not? Oh, I'm banned. Right? And everyone's like, what do you do? And something, I'll tell you this, and you'll just go, yeah, I can. That's unbelievable. Like what happened. So I used to do a lot of running. I was a runner growing up. And I got myself one year a seated start. This is different to a preferred start. This is your name, not a number. So I had Wallace, right, on my bib. It was a very special day. Right, a couple of days before the event, I get injured. I just calf strain. I'm out. Right, a mate of mine says, "Oh, Lee, can I have your entry?" And I'm like, "What do I care?" Like, he wants a good result. You had to, all those guys there are doing, at least in the 40s somethings. This guy here couldn't break 70 on his best day. But I'm thinking, he'd just get lost in 80,000. Who cares? So I give him a bib, right? I'm sitting at home watching TV. Next minute, I see him getting a pre-race interview on the start line. He's on the start line, like warming up with the Kenyans, right? This guy's 6'5", tennis player, huge guy. Kenyan, him. Kenyan, how do you like your chances today? Whatever. I'm just going, you idiot, you're meant to be maintaining a low profile, but I still don't panic. He begins to run, right, and he's just legging it down the road, right, and he's thinking in his head, this is my chance to maybe break 60 because I'm in such a good spot here. Like, this is amazing. I would never do this on any other time. He turns to the guy next to him and goes, how we going, mate? Are we on sub 60 pace? And the guy goes, mate, we're on sub 50 pace. Like, you're an idiot. Like this, you're flying. And he's like, oh, shit, this is going to be interesting, right? He continues running. He gets the heartbreak hill. He explodes. Like, he's not feeling good now. He's like, well, one thing about this mate, wasn't a good runner, but he's a mental case. Like, he knows how to push himself. So he thinks, I'll never get a chance like this again. He just keeps going mentally hard. He's pushing himself. His leg's starting to hurt, right? Next minute, he's he ends up with a broken leg. He doesn't know it at this point. He's literally done. One of these examples is somewhere in the middle, right? He crosses the line. He's got a completely fractured leg. He ends up in an ambulance off at a hospital. Okay? They don't even, he's in so much pain. They just take your bib, which is linked to your name, which is my name. Next minute, I'm involved in some kind of insurance fraud thing. Because your entry, when you pay for entry, you're paying for, your medical, coverage and blah, blah, blah for the event. I'm sitting at home, I'm not even there. I get a letter. He's explained it all. This is what happened. I get a letter a week later basically saying, you're not welcome back. So that's my city surf / muscle fatigue fracture story. So how do you get it banned? Do nothing. Don't even turn up. You're banned anyway. So we've got Wolff's Law. We know that Wolff's Law, a bone grows and remodels to the force placed upon it. So we know this already. We know that the two forces are gravitational and muscle pull, right? These are the two ways we get force. Now, it operates in reverse as well. As we know, bed rest will cause atrophy, right? So if you lie in bed, you do nothing. You're going to lose about 1% of our bone mineral density per week. That's a lot. That's significant. And a couple of years back, NASA was offering 18,000 for 70 days of bed rest. I was thinking about it at the time. I was a bit broke. I was thinking at 18 grand looks all right. Right, as it turns out, 70 days is a really, really long time. Right, so 70 days, and they were trying to work out, because bed rest is reflective of bone stress in space. Right, so they're thinking, well, we can see what happens to the bone, and in space, it's similar. So if you go online and just have a look at like exercise in space, some of the things that they do in order to maintain bone mineral density, so you don't lose 1% a week, is quite interesting. So firstly, they've got treadmills, right? And the treadmills, they've got these elastic bands that they strap to a harness, which pull them down. So they're like kind of constantly this down load. So they're running, and it's like pulling them. So they've still got loading taking place. Second thing they do is, obviously, if you started doing free weights, they press down and up at the same time on like a machine that opens like a clam, if you like. So they'll go, and the machine will create the load, right? And then they can change that to like arms and do all kinds of different exercises. But they're always under this kind of pressurized load situation, and they work out up to 2 hours a day while they're in space in order to combat this. It's quite interesting. So when you look at the actual bone geometry, and I mentioned before, look at those thick parts of the cortical bone as it runs down the side, and we know that there's a bending moment going on the femur, which means the outside of the femur is placed at tension, the inside of the femur is placed at compression right around that point. When we look back at that x-ray, those layers of the wall were the absolute thickest in the cortical bone, right around those points, because that's where the stress is being placed upon it, and particularly in the compression, because the bone responds to the compression. It's there for the compression more than anything else. So the thickest part of the bone will be right on that apex, on the inside edge. Cortical bone will be right, really thick and really strong. So a bone also, like any material, right, is stronger when the material is further away from the center. Right? It's an interesting phenomenon. So when you take a bar, like say a steel bar, the reason for a hollow steel bar of the same amount of metal, right, is because the further the actual load is distributed from the center, the stronger it is. So if you took the same amount of metal, melted it down and put it in like a thin rod, right, same amount of metal, that'd be a lot weaker. Where it's further away, so it's a fatter bar, if you like, it's stronger. Bone responds and works in the exact same way. In other words, if these three items here are of the same matter, and I put a load on them where the black arrows are, the first one will be a lot easier to bend than the third one, because the third one has more material away from the neutral surface. Right? So I could bend that first one, I could just sort of bend it. There's this one here, a lot more difficult, but it's the same stuff. So when you look at a bone, that's why it's hollow through the middle like that. You look at this is the cross section of the tibia, the top. You've got the material placed quite far away from that central axis. At the bottom, it's a lot closer. For the same reason, a tibia is stronger at the top than the bottom. Right? The further away, the better. The closer, the worse. Now, when you look at male, female, so men at the top, female at the bottom, particularly early on, so before puberty, during puberty, the changes start happening. What actually happens with the males when they distribute their bone takes away from the inside and places it on the outside. So you get more around that periosteum area bone. Whereas the females, you see that third picture on the bottom, it goes on the endocortical surface. So the bone actually packs up on the inside a lot more, which means even if you've got the same amount of matter, the male bone is a lot stronger than the female bone because of where the actual bone is distributed from the axis. And then because we age, we'll all lose, but at different rates. Female lose more as well. And that's due to estrogen essentially controlling where bone is deposited. So as we age, beyond about 40, we're losing different rates. You can see the figures down here. Males losing between 0.5 and 0.75. Females 1.5 to 2.5. Losing beyond 40, and it progresses down. We lose both thickening of the cortical bone and less amount of cancellous bone. Age, gender, due to hormones, estrogens, inactivity, we know from Wolff's law, and minerals, different mineral deficiencies will create all kinds of losses in bone mineral density. And here we see male and female, it peaks up around just 40 or just earlier, and then we all lose, and we see the bone become more porous as we age, reduction in bone mineral density. Now, when we're old, it's more so the deformation, the strain that is affected rather than the stress. So the amount of stress a bone can undertake as we age, similar because we lose more in the cancellous bone than the cortical bone. So what that means is that an old person's bone compared to a young person's bone will act more like glass. It'll be very strong, but when it does break, it'll shatter. It won't deform very much before breaking. So old person, just think old person, more brittle bones. It's hard, but it's brittle. And then a younger person bone, still hard, but then there's more strain that it can undertake, more deformation prior to actual shatter point. Let's go revision. Now, we saw the first movement analysis last week. I've been talking to the tutors saying, how's everyone going? And they kind of went like, which means some good, some bad, right? So I'm going to be throwing this stuff at you all year, and we'll see how we go. So the trunk extension from a fixed position is an example of which type of lever system? All right, I'm going to show the hands. Show me lever one, show me the ones, two, show me twos, three, show me threes, ones again, show me ones. Ones are right, very good. Right. All right, you've got to think it's very similar to the neck situation where you've got load on the front. You've got the fulcrum being essentially where your spine joints will be, and then the muscles that will pick you up will be behind the spine. That is a type 1 lever. Fulcrum between load and effort. Let's go again. What if I said what type of lever system is the peg an example of? Who thinks one? Show me the one. Ones, twos, show me twos. Twos on two, who's on three? Show me the threes, show me the ones again. One's the answer, right? Effort, fulcrum, load, that's the actual resistance. That's where it's coming from, right? That is a first-class lever. You guys got to get up on your levers, right? All right, which muscle is the agonist of extension, elbow extension, that occurs during the lifting phase of the tricep extension? What's the answer? Yell it out, you know it. Tricep brachii. Everyone's thinking there's a trick now. No tricks, tricep brachii. I'm lulling you into the trick in a few slides. What am I doing? Hang on. What? Right. Which muscle is the agonist of elbow extension that occurs during the lowering phase of the bicep curl? Who thinks bicep brachii? Who thinks tricep brachii? Bicep brachii is correct. Most of you had it. I'll say 80%. Right? The lowering, you see lowering, you think eccentric. You think eccentric, it's whatever put it up, puts it down. Bicep brachii. Which muscle is the agonist of knee flexion that occurs during the lowering phase of the lunge? I'm talking about the front knee here. So front knee, I'm lowering, my knee is flexing. Which muscle is the one muscle that is doing this more than the others? What's the answer? Yell it. Who thinks rectus femoris? I've heard rectus femoris. Who's on that? Who's on gluteus maximus? Who's on biceps femoris? Who's on gastrocnemius? I don't know who'd be on gastrocnemius. Rectus femoris. Which muscle is the agonist of the hip flexion that occurs during the lowering phase of the squat? Yell it out, what is it? Who thinks iliopsoas? Who thinks gluteus maximus? This is 50-50 here. Half of you are right, half of you are wrong. I'll give you a hint. It does say lowering. That's got to be that's what's going on here. Who would like to change their answer? 50% here. Who thinks iliopsoas? Who thinks gluteus maximus? The answer is gluteus maximus. All right. Why? All right. So lowering, there's eccentric. All right. So that would be the same as asking, what is the agonist of hip extension when I'm standing? Reverse the problem. Think if I stand up, it's the glute doing that at the hip. Therefore, if I'm lowering down, it's the glute doing that at the hip. Right? It's always the same. Final one you wouldn't have seen yet. It is, which muscle is the agonist of the hip flexion that occurs during the follow-through phase of the soccer kick? Follow-through means the ball is being kicked and now I'm just following through. This is a new problem. Someone yell out something. What do you got? What? Someone yell out something correct. Who thinks this is iliopsoas? Who thinks this is gluteus maximus? The answer is gluteus maximus. I'll tell you why. Let me tell you why. Lowering and slowing down are the same, right? Now, in other words, think about, just picture this, right? Picture this. I've kicked the ball, I'm at full pace here. I'm getting, right? Now, from the moment I kick the ball to the moment my leg stops here, that is slowed down. That is slowed down, right? Now, that must mean something behind here is working to slow it down, or else if it was the front, it would be like, you know. So it's the exact same problem as lowering. Anytime you got slowing down, think of it like lowering. So my hip is still flexing, but it's slowing down. Therefore, what would extend it? Gluteus maximus would extend it, and there's your answer. More of that to come. We'll see you this week in the tutorials.